Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is the 1954 Japanese horror science fiction classic, Godzilla, also known as Gojira, which is the Japanese pronunciation of the title. Ishiro Honda's magnum opus, which spawned an entire franchise, arguably one of the most popular and longest-running franchises out there, and this is a movie that I totally have never talked about on this channel before. Except for the fact that I did review this movie back in 2012 along with all the sequels that were out at the time. And then in 2014, when the Gareth Edwards Godzilla reboot came out, I did a series of videos related to that, and then in 2017 I did a 4-part retrospective on the Godzilla franchise with my friend Bill, and just last year I did a video with my friend Bill on our favorite Godzilla films besides the original, and then I did reviews on the anime Godzilla trilogy, and then I did a review with my friend Cam on the most recent Godzilla film. So, yes, I have talked about Godzilla many times on this channel before, but I decided to redo most of my Godzilla reviews. Now, I did review Shin Godzilla a number of years ago, and I decided to leave that review up, as well as my reviews on the anime trilogy and the review of Godzilla King of the Monsters I did with Cam last year. So, basically what I'm doing is I'm redoing my reviews on everything from the original film to Godzilla 2014, and of course that 4-part retrospective that I did with my friend Bill, that's remaining up as well. Now, I have Gojira both on the Classic Media DVD, which was released in 2006, and I also have the Criterion Blu-ray of the film. Now, unfortunately, I got this Blu-ray used, and the case is kind of coming apart, but that's okay because, while this is a great release of the film, and I'm so happy that Criterion released Godzilla, I'm not the biggest fan of the Blu-ray's cover art. For some reason, I find it to be kinda ugly. It's too reminiscent of the Millennium Godzilla series for me, and it's weird because Criterion usually has really good cover art for the movies they put out, but this isn't a review on the Blu-ray, this is a review on the movie itself. Now, I've said it many times before, but the original Godzilla is my favorite film of all time. Not just my favorite monster film, and not just my favorite horror or science fiction film, it's my favorite film of any genre, because it really is a far deeper and much more political movie than the sequels would lead you to believe. And this is really more of a drama film that just happens to feature a giant monster as the main antagonist, but the film is not so much about the monster, rather it's about why the monster exists. It's really about what the monster represents. And I would honestly rank this movie right alongside the films of Akira Kurosawa as an excellent example of Japanese cinema. And Ishiro Honda, who directed the movie, was a protege of Kurosawa, and I think what he learned from Kurosawa shows on Gojira. But I think if you only know Godzilla from the sequels, you might actually be shocked at how dark and depressing this original film is. And it's taken very seriously. It's handled, dare I say, realistically. Yes, the idea of a giant monster is ludicrous and can't happen in real life, but the way the characters act in the movie, it's how I would imagine people actually reacting if a giant monster really did show up. Like, obviously, it's not a realistic story, but it's as reality-based as a story like this could possibly be. Now, Godzilla was produced and distributed by Japanese film company Toho, and this movie and the franchise that this movie would spawn really is what Toho is best known for, at least in the States. But Godzilla was really the brainchild of producer Tomoyuki Tanaka, who wanted to do a giant monster movie in the vein of some of the American monster movies like the original King Kong or The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. Actually, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, which was based on a short story by Ray Bradbury called The Foghorn, is probably what had the biggest influence on Gojira. Like, as much as I do love this movie, and I do think this film is a masterpiece, it is basically a Japanese ripoff of The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. But it's an example of a ripoff that actually outshines the film it's ripping off. Now, Japanese horror novelist Shigeru Kayama, I have no idea if I'm saying his name right, but he was hired to write the original story for Godzilla, and he actually released a novelization of the film the same year. But the final screenplay of the film was written by Ishiro Honda and Takahito Murata. I probably butchered that. And Honda, of course, directed the film, and the effects work in the film was done by Eiji Tsuburaya, who was a huge admirer of Willis O'Brien's effects in the original King Kong, and I heard that he initially wanted to do the effects in this movie in stop motion, but estimated that it would take years to actually do all the effects in stop motion for this movie, so he settled for suitmation, and this was really the film that pioneered that art form. Now, while Godzilla was certainly a collaborative effort between all the men that I mentioned, I do not think this film would have been the same if not for Honda. Because I have the feeling that Tanaka just wanted to make a generic monster movie, and it was really Honda who brought a lot of his politics to the film and made it this great anti-war statement. And ultimately, I think that's what separates the original Godzilla from American monster movies of the same type. In a lot of the American monster movies that were coming out around this time, they would use the concept of atomic radiation creating monsters as sort of a plot device and as sort of a way to exploit America's fears of atomic radiation, because this was right at the beginning of the Cold War era. But in Gojira, Honda uses that premise of radiation creating a monster to actually make a political statement. Because while this is a fantastical movie, there were several real-life tragedies that inspired this movie. One, of course, is the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II, but another is an incident that happened early in 1954 when the United States tested its first hydrogen bomb, and there was a Japanese fishing boat called the Lucky Dragon 5, which sailed a little too close to the testing site, and the ship was actually littered with radioactive fallout. Like, fallout just rained down on the fishermen, and these men would later suffer from severe radiation sickness. Now, from what I understand, all but one of these men did recover, but even the men who recovered, I believe, had health problems for the rest of their lives because of this. And this real-life event is reflected in the opening scene of Gojira. And this incident kicked off a renewed nuclear scare in Japan at the time. And in the film, Godzilla is an allegory for the atomic bomb. Like, he's essentially the atomic bomb made flesh. And really, the film feels more like a film about nuclear war that just happens to use a giant monster as a stand-in for nuclear war. So, in a way, I would actually compare Gojira not so much to movies like The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms or Them, but more to quote-unquote serious films about the bomb like On the Beach or Dr. Strangelove or The Day After or Threads. Now, during the Second World War, Ishiro Honda was drafted into the Japanese army several times, and during the final years of the war, he was held as a POW in China. But Honda was deeply affected by not just his wartime experiences, but by seeing the aftermath of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And after the war, Honda became a pacifist and became very, very anti-war and very anti-nuke. I don't know if he ever became like an out-and-out activist, but he felt very strongly that no country should have nuclear weapons. I think he definitely felt that the atomic bombings of Japan should have been the wake-up call to the world to never use these weapons again, and what is the United States and the Soviet Union doing? Testing weapons that make the bombs dropped on Japan look like firecrackers. So, Godzilla really does feel like a very personal film, and it feels like a film that's really coming from a place of pain and anger. And the original Godzilla really is one of the most political horror films out there. I would rank it right alongside George Romero's Night of the Living Dead or John Carpenter's They Live. And yes, I do consider Gojira to be a horror film. The sequels, not so much, because the sequels definitely moved away from horror, but I do consider the original Godzilla to be a horror film. But it's also a drama film as well, because it's really about the human characters and about how their lives are being disrupted by the appearance of this giant monster. Now, the plot of Godzilla, or Gojira, is it begins with a series of mysterious ship disasters happening off the coast of Japan, and the Japanese authorities are at a loss to explain what's causing these disasters. But the only survivor of one of these ship disasters is a native of this small island called Kōdō Island, and he claims that his fishing boat was attacked by a creature. And eventually this creature attacks the island. Now, on Kōdō Island, they have this legend of an ancient demon called Godzilla, and some of the natives on Kōdō Island believe that this creature is the demon from their legend. But soon the Japanese government and the public become aware of the existence of this creature, and this creature ends up getting the name Godzilla based on the legend of Kōdō Island. But one of the main characters, a paleontologist named Professor Amani, theorizes that Godzilla is some kind of prehistoric creature that has been laying dormant for millions of years, but was awoken and mutated by a hydrogen bomb test. So now Japan and the rest of the world is being threatened by this creature that has the power to wipe out the human race, and eventually in the movie Godzilla attacks Tokyo and completely devastates the city. Now in the film there's a troubled scientist named Dr. Serizawa who has created a device called the Oxygen Destroyer, which might be the only thing that can kill Godzilla. The issue is he's reluctant to use it because this device could potentially be a greater threat to the world than the creature itself. Now, sure, the premise of Godzilla might sound like your typical 50s B-movie premise, but what really makes the movie work is the characters, because the characters genuinely feel like real people, and they respond to the situation like this is a real situation happening. Like, when you get to the later Godzilla sequels, it got to a point where really you're just watching the movies for Godzilla, but for this original film, you're watching it for the human characters, because really it's a film about these characters and how their lives are being affected by the appearance of this creature. Now, in the film, Takashi Shimura, who is in many of Akira Kurosawa's films, plays the character of Professor Yamane. Now, towards the beginning of the film, when Godzilla is first discovered, Yamane doesn't want the military to kill Godzilla because he feels this creature's existence is a really important and possibly vital scientific discovery. And you certainly have seen characters like this in other science fiction films. An example that really comes to mind is the scientist character from 1951's The Thing from Another World. But in this movie, I feel the whole scientist wanting to keep the monster alive archetype is handled a lot more realistically and much more three-dimensionally. Granted, that could just be because of how well Takashi Shimura plays this character, because there's a reason this guy was considered to be one of the great Japanese actors. And in this movie, you completely see Yamane's point of view. You might not agree with it, because keeping this creature alive puts millions, potentially even billions of people at risk. Yet, on the same token, here is a creature that we thought was extinct, alive today in the 20th century, which is when this movie came out. What scientist wouldn't want to keep a creature like this alive? But so much of this film is really about the ethics of science, and when is science going too far? Is keeping a creature like Godzilla alive really going to benefit mankind in the long run? And shouldn't science always be there to better mankind? But I also saw another subtext with Yamane being annoyed with the Japanese military for wanting to kill Godzilla, in the sense that maybe he's disillusioned with the Japanese military and the Japanese government in general, because after all, it was Japan's military aggression that was one of the main things that led to World War II. Then you have Yamane's daughter, Emiko, played by Momoko Kōchi. I'm sure I butchered her name. Granted, I probably butchered half the Japanese names in this video, which I do apologize for. I actually think Emiko is a great character, and for a film from the 50s, she's a surprisingly well-rounded female character. And I actually think this movie does have a bit of a feminist undercurrent with the character of Emiko. Because in the movie you find out that Emiko is engaged to Serizawa, but this is not really her choice. This was actually an arranged marriage. Apparently it was something that was arranged by her father, because Serizawa is sort of a protege of her father. But Emiko is actually in love with a young Marine officer named Ogata. So you have sort of a love triangle in the film, which might sound cheesy, but this is an example where a love triangle actually works, because it's actually really important to the story, and actually really important to something that Serizawa does at the end of the movie. And it's also really important to the themes, especially the subtle feminist undercurrent where Emiko is going to make her own decisions. She's not going to go along with this arranged marriage, regardless of what her father says, regardless of what Serizawa says. She's going to love who she wants to love. And I think that was also meant to reflect the changes that Japan was going through after the war. Now, in the film, Ogata is played by Akira Takarada, who would actually go on to be a reoccurring actor in many of the Godzilla sequels. However, he never played the same character. And Takarada, he's good in the movie, but the character of Ogata is kind of a weak character. Like, he's certainly not an unlikable character, but compared to the other characters in the film, he is sort of bland. Like, he's just sort of the pretty boy hero. And then you have the character of Dr. Serizawa, played by Akihiko Hirata, who, like Akira Takarada, would go on to be a reoccurring actor in several of the Godzilla sequels, again, never playing the same character. But Serizawa is easily the most complex and interesting character in the film. In a lot of ways, he is the hero of this movie. Like, he's a deeply troubled man. He was a man who was scarred during World War II, and he was probably traumatized by his wartime experiences. And I like how in the movie, it seems like he knows, even though Emiko never tells him, it seems like he knows that her and Ogata have a thing, but I like how it doesn't seem like he resents her for it. Like, he gets it. He's understandably heartbroken about it, but he still gets it. Now, of course, in the movie, Serizawa creates the oxygen destroyer. Now, the whole concept of the oxygen destroyer is very comic booky, it's very high concept, and it's pure pseudoscience. But it's handled so realistically in the film where it's like, okay, what if a scientist really did discover a chemical compound that could destroy all oxygen and water? Granted, it wouldn't do what the oxygen destroyer does in the movie, but again, thematically it works. The whole point of the oxygen destroyer is it's another metaphor for the atomic bomb. The same way Godzilla is a metaphor for the atomic bomb, so is the oxygen destroyer. And the oxygen destroyer, it's the only thing that can kill Godzilla, but the reason Serizawa doesn't want to use it is because using it would mean telling the public, and if he tells the public about this, he knows that politicians from all over the world will find out about this, and they would want to mass produce it. And his fear is that the oxygen destroyer could fall into the hands of warmongers, and there could be another arms race, even worse than the nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. So again, as outlandish as the concept of the oxygen destroyer and the concept of Godzilla is, it makes sense thematically because really this film is an anti-war statement. It's an anti-nuclear statement. Now, throughout most of the film, Godzilla was portrayed by suit actor Haruo Nakajima. However, Katsumi Tezuka, I probably butchered that name, also plays Godzilla in a few shots in the movie. Now, a lot of people today look back on this movie and the sequels and they just think, oh, guy in a rubber suit, but what people don't realize is just how hellish it was to be in these suits. Like, the suits were heavy as hell and the actors would sweat pounds and pounds of sweat. And I actually think a lot of Eiji Tsuburaya's effects in this movie still hold up today. Some of them don't. Like, there are a few shots of Godzilla's head where they use a puppet for his head, and it's so clearly a puppet. But then there are some shots of Godzilla in this movie, particularly the stuff taking place at night, where Godzilla legitimately looks pretty scary. And there are actually some really impressive optical effects in this movie. For example, there's a shot of Godzilla coming up over a building, and this was not some miniature building built for Haruo Nakajima to knock down. What this was a shot of a real building because you see people in the windows, and they composited a shot of one of the suit actors rising up, making it look like he's rising up over the building. So what I'm trying to say is a lot more work went into the effects than people give it credit for. And also, even the miniature sets, you gotta keep in mind how much time and effort that must take to build all those sets. Now, while Godzilla is the villain of the film and is this metaphor for atomic destruction, Godzilla is sympathetic in the film as well because, in a lot of ways, it is a victim of the bomb. It didn't ask to be mutated by the bomb in this way. But Godzilla is not just a metaphor for the bomb, but is also sort of a metaphor for war in general. Like, it is the physical manifestation of war. Now, this movie came out in the 50s, which was the beginning of the Cold War, and Godzilla could be seen as a representation of the Cold War and the possibility of the Cold War escalating into World War III. But Godzilla is also a representation of World War II, the things that were done to Japan during the war, and in a way you could also look at Godzilla as sort of a representation of what Japan did to other countries before and during World War II. Like, Godzilla is really a representation of the horrible things that we've done as a species, both to nature and to each other. And Honda shoots the film in an almost documentary style, which gives the film an air of realism. And when you see the aftermath of Godzilla's attack on Tokyo, it's shot almost like the aftermath of a war, particularly the aftermath of a nuclear attack. Again, really calling to mind Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And considering that this movie came out less than 10 years after the war, this movie must have struck a real chord with Japanese audiences at the time. Now, in the movie you realize that Godzilla leaves radioactive fallout in his wake, and there's a certain point after Godzilla's attack on Tokyo where one of Yamani's colleagues is pointing a Geiger counter at this little boy, showing that the boy has been irradiated, implying that a lot of the people who survived Godzilla's attack on Tokyo are probably going to die from radiation poisoning later on. So, while it's certainly not realistic for radiation to create giant monsters, this movie does try to show the realistic effects of radiation. And that's a detail that got completely lost in the sequels. Even some of the better sequels never got quite that dark. So, it's a film that really does reflect Japan's anxiety about nuclear war. Now, of course, during the Cold War period, every country was afraid of the possibility of nuclear war breaking out between the United States and the Soviet Union, but I'm sure Japan was especially scared of that happening, considering that they're the only country that has actually been bombed with nuclear weapons. Now, there's a scene towards the beginning of the film when Godzilla's existence is revealed to the public, where you see these three people on a train, and one of them mentions how she survived the atomic bombing of Nagasaki. And in that same scene, one of them says that because of Godzilla, they're probably gonna have to go back to the shelters, and somebody else says, "The shelters again. That stinks." And there are some really powerful scenes in this movie. There's one scene in particular that always got to me where this mother is with her children and Godzilla is attacking the city and is not too far from them, and this woman realizes that they're not going to make it out of there, so she tells her children, "We'll see your father soon in heaven." And then there's a scene where there's this little girl crying over her dead mother, and it lingers on this to a point where it honestly gets kind of uncomfortable. Like, that's not the kind of thing you expect to see in a giant monster movie, and it scenes like that really elevate Godzilla above American monster films that were coming out around the same time, and that's not to disparage the American monster films. Like, I love movies like them, or Tarantula, or The Deadly Mantis. Like, I love the 50s giant bug movies, but it's scenes like this that really make Godzilla a lot more sophisticated than those movies. And then in the movie, there's this news broadcast where you see all these girls singing in a choir, and it's one of the most powerful things you'll see in a monster movie. Actually, James Rolfe, in his review of the original Godzilla, summed it up perfectly. He said they don't treat it like a B-movie, they treat it like a real disaster. Now, it would be a crime and a sin not to talk about Akira Ifukube's iconic score for this movie. Like, everything from, like, the military march to the more melancholy aspects of the score adds so much to this movie. And even that iconic as hell Godzilla theme that da-da-da, 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 da-da, and I know my version didn't do it justice at all, and I'm sure some Akira Ifukube fans probably just committed suicide right now. But that theme has become so iconic that even people who aren't big Godzilla fans know that theme. Now, while I do love this movie to death, it is my favorite film of all time, it does have some minor flaws. For example, Yamane in the film is supposed to be this world-renowned paleontologist, yet at one point he says that the Jurassic period was 2 million years ago, when in reality it was a hell of a lot longer than that. Like, I'm not an expert on this, but I'm pretty sure that even 2 million years ago, dinosaurs were already long extinct at that point, yet you have Yamane in this movie, who again is supposedly this really great paleontologist, saying that that's when dinosaurs were walking the earth. Now, apparently that's a factual error that originated from Kayama's original script, and somehow it made it into the final film. Also, everybody remembers the iconic scene where Godzilla is tearing through the high-tension wires, but apparently that's actually supposed to be an electrical fence that the Japanese government has put up around Tokyo to keep Godzilla out. But it seems like this electrical fence was only put up in a matter of days, so it's a bit of a suspension of disbelief, especially because the rest of the movie has such an attention to realism. But those are minor flaws, and it's not enough to get me to all of a sudden not like the movie. I still think this is a masterpiece in the horror and science fiction genre, and it's a masterpiece in Japanese filmmaking. And this will probably forever remain my favorite film of all time. Now, Gojira was released in America 2 years later under the title Godzilla King of the Monsters. However, this version of the film was drastically re-edited and featured additional scenes featuring a character played by Raymond. Now, I'll talk about this version of the film after I cut to a series of short reviews that some friends of mine have done on this movie.
How's it going, everybody? I am a.k.a, now known as eRockstar5 as well on YouTube now. How you all doing? Christian, my good buddy, asked me to pop in here, do a little review on the original Godzilla film, and so yeah, that's what we're gonna do.
Okay, what the fuck?
Hey there, buddy.
You're changing your channel again.
What? No, I'm not.
Yes, you are. You're not Dreammaker Productions anymore since you haven't uploaded in about 5 years.
Well, I mean, I got busy. I got a job, and
now you're eRockstar5 and haven't uploaded anything yet.
Yeah, well, I'm working on it. What do you call all this?
A video that isn't going to be uploaded onto your channel, but a video that will appear on Kanto's channel. and he will get all the views and all the likes, while yours continues to sit there at the bottom of the YouTube algorithm with a wallpaper and a profile pic, and that's it. I believe in aliens.
Okay, Ross.
I believe
Okay.
that giant monsters are gonna rise from the oceans.
I'm
and
going to
Earth
take you, and I'm going to put you down here, and you're going to sit there until episode 2, okay? Okay. Okay. Hey everybody, how's it going? I am Eric Casey, now as eRockstar5 on YouTube as well. Please go over there and subscribe. And how's it going, everybody? My good buddy Christian over at Canto 1408 asked me to jump in and do this little cameo review of Godzilla, King of the Monsters, the original, the one that started it all in the Godzilla franchise. What I have is Godzilla, King of Monsters, and I have two versions. I have the original Japanese cut right here on DVD. It also has the English release as well. It comes with a cool book and everything, as you can see. And it has the English version as well, with Raymond Barr awkwardly sprinkled in here and there to kind of guide the story along. for the ones who don't like subtitles. And and the other version I have is the Criterion Collection release of Godzilla, King of Monsters as well. And what's interesting about this film is that the original Godzilla, if you look at the Godzilla films that came after this film, as time went on, Godzilla's kind of turned into an icon culturally and all that, and they kind of Hollywood him up. And instead of being a giant monster, they kind of turned Godzilla into the hero in most of the films that followed this. But what's interesting about the original Godzilla film is that it's kind of similar to like the Terminator in a way, where Godzilla, the icon, the giant lizard that saves everybody from other giant monsters, he wasn't exactly that. He was actually the giant monster. He was the antagonist in the original version. In this version, Godzilla, King of Monsters, Godzilla was actually the monster. And he was actually the one that was causing all the ruckus, causing all the destruction and everything. The whole point of the story was basically it was a commentary on the fallout of nuclear warfare from World War II. It's a commentary on that and what ramifications that's going to have in the environment. What are the ramifications from our continuing technological advancements? They're great and beneficial, yes, but at what cost? Because potentially, who knows what we will eventually create. And like I said, it's kind of similar to the Terminator franchise as well. Again, going with that technological advancement by humans, and ultimately, basically us with our continuing advancements, creating the very enemy that will cause our demise potentially. And the original film, this film particularly, plays it up super seriously, where you see the monster rise from the ocean, you see him literally destroy the entire town and just wipe it out completely. We actually even see the aftermath of the destruction as well from the people's perspective, which is something that the later Godzilla, the later American Godzilla films have tried to do, but kind of failed at it. They kind of failed at it. This is still... What's great about this film is that it perfectly balances the monster stuff, the monster destruction, and the the aftermath of the whole destruction and everything, even from the human's perspective. Because like I said, a lot of the later films, especially the more recent American Godzilla films, kind of fail in this area where the humans and the aftermath of the destruction, when it's taken seriously, it's just not executed very well. What's cool about this film is that this was all done with practical effects. Nowadays, it's all done in computer CGI and all that fun stuff. And I get it. The CGI is beneficial and everything, but I still have a soft heart for practical effects and actors dressed in giant rubber costumes and walking about on miniature sets. Because that's how this film was done. It was a guy who put on a rubber suit, and they basically created miniature basically made this town in a miniature scale and had him walking around and destroying everything. So final thoughts. The film's a classic. It's what started the franchise. There's no other way of putting it. The original Godzilla is among it's probably the best Godzilla film out of the entire franchise, to be honest. And the reason why that is, like I said, it's the film that's taken the most seriously. The story is very good and very interesting. It's an interesting take on, like I was saying before, about like the flaws of humans and technological advancements, stuff like that. It really poses the question of, with us as humans continuing to advance in technology, is it for the better good though? And is it morally justified? And will it be our undoing? Will technology be our undoing? Whether it be, the rise of machines or the results of the king, or creating the king of all monsters. Like I said, the original Godzilla film is great. I can't recommend it highly. I can't recommend it any more than I can. I recommend it highly. It's just one of those classics that will stand the test of time, in my opinion. Godzilla holds a special place in my heart as well. I grew up with it. I was a big fan of it. I watched so much Godzilla. I used to watch all the movies on Spike TV, and I watched the Hanna-Barbera cartoon as well. So, highly recommend it. Definitely check it out, especially the original. You can't go wrong with it.
There are a lot of great films out there that show you the effects of war, and there are a lot of great films out there and TV shows that show you the effects of atomic power and nuclear power, what happens when you weaponize that stuff and use it. And Godzilla is definitely one of the best films to deal with this stuff, because not only does it show you the effects of war, but it also shows you the effects of atomic power, the atomic bomb, what happened after, the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima in World War II. And it does it so brilliantly. It does it artistically. It does it in the, it uses this great metaphor of this giant kaiju creature, Godzilla, that, was formed from atomic power, and then, of course, uses atomic power to destroy Tokyo completely. And the aftermath of that is horrible. I mean, this film really shows you what people really go through. I mean, yes, we've never had a giant creature attack yet, but it does show you what happens after you go and weaponize something and just use it, and people die and people get sick, and it's just horrible. It destroys entire civilizations. War is bad. Atomic power is evil. To be using that stuff in this way, nuclear power is as well. And I just love that Godzilla does it so brilliantly, and it takes it seriously. There's no joking around in this. This is a serious movie. This was meant to be pretty much a response to the whole World War II attacks. That's pretty much what it was. It was to show you what had happened and what could happen with this whole scientific revolution that was going on in the military. And I love Godzilla to death. This is one of the best films I've ever seen. Godzilla himself is a creature that is very fascinating to me ever since I was a kid, because it's this giant, pretty much a dragon. I know he's not really a dragon, but I always saw him as a dragon because he is this giant lizard that shoots something out of its mouth and it just destroys and devastates. That's pretty much what dragons do. And that's why Godzilla has always been pretty much my favorite one. I think it might be biased as well because of the fact that he was the first kaiju creature I ever saw. Now Godzilla, this movie was not the first one I ever saw. The first one I ever saw was Godzilla vs. King Kong, but I'll get to that eventually. Right now, we're just dealing with the serious one, and the serious one, it's a great film. It's a really heartbreaking film. It's a really devastating one, but it's very important. I think, this film should definitely stick around forever, and people should watch it, study it, not only to learn about, the effects of war, but also to learn filmmaking. I mean, it's shot brilliantly, acting is brilliant, writing fantastic, special effects, for the time, definitely beautiful. I mean, I love how destructive it gets at times. I mean, this is an old film, but it really is amazing to see what they did at the time. Godzilla, yes, he's pretty much a man in a suit, but with everything else going on, the fact that everybody takes this so seriously, the fact that the filmmakers did and the actors did, you just kind of ignore the fact that it is a man in a suit, and you just see this as this giant creature, this giant monster attacking these people, and you really do take it seriously. You get engaged in it. You don't care about the toys that are flying around, the cars and all that stuff. You don't care about any of that, because at the end of the day, it takes it very, very seriously. And yeah, Godzilla is... I highly recommend Godzilla to everybody if you've never seen this film before. If you've only seen the new ones and you want to check out the old ones, check it out. If you're interested in film history, check out Godzilla. It's one of the greatest Japanese films that ever existed. Of course, it's called Gojira over there, but I just get so used to calling it Godzilla, I call him Godzilla. Definitely check this film out. Everybody should check it out. And yeah, thank you so much. Bye-bye.
This is my review on Gojira 1954, a.k.a. Godzilla for Christian's channel. First off, I'll admit that I am not a big die-hard Godzilla fan, but at the same time, I've never had a problem to go watch a Godzilla film every now and then. Also, as a kid growing up, I did want to see more Godzilla films. I just never could find them all or had the chance to watch them all on television. I remember they used to show them on TV, I just don't remember which ones I watched as a kid. Despite what people think of Gojira 1954 as a 50s B-movie sci-fi monster film, the film really is more than just that. Godzilla is a symbol of nuclear destruction. Ishiro Honda does a great job of showing of what Japan was like and was going through after the post-bombings of the Hiroshima bombings during World War II. As if you were really watching a real documentary on that, to a certain degree. Also, despite what people think about the special effects being outdated, which sometimes they are outdated, but other times the effects are really good, like when it's dark out, not seeing Godzilla where he is, that's what makes it really scary for a great atmosphere. One of the saddest things in the movie is when you're watching the television, you've seen the girls singing a choir. It's like one of the saddest things I've ever watched in a film.
Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well and staying safe. So my friend Christian is doing reviews on the Godzilla series, and I will be helping him out with reviewing the first one, Gojira, and the one from 2014. So all in all, I really enjoyed watching this classic monster movie. It's definitely one of the most iconic ones ever made. I'll admit, I'm not the most die-hard Godzilla fan, and I haven't seen all the movies, but I still have a great appreciation for how iconic Godzilla is. One of the things I like is the foreboding sense of dread that's constantly felt throughout the film. This movie takes things very seriously, and Godzilla is treated as no joke, whereas later entries in the series definitely became more comical, and Godzilla became much less of a threat. In the film, Godzilla is mentioned to be a product of the atomic bomb, which is because of the real-life atomic bomb that was dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, there's definitely some real-world basis here, Godzilla sort of being a metaphor for the bombs that were dropped on those two Japanese cities. Godzilla is really cool to look at, and I like the design of the suit. That being said, it is pretty obvious that it is a man in a suit stomping on miniature sets that you're looking at. Of course, that's not to say that it isn't impressive that they were able to pull that off at the time. I've read about what Haruo Nakajima had to go through while wearing that suit, and I must say that his strength and endurance are truly to be admired. The inside of the Godzilla suit was incredibly hot, and he once said that his sweat could fill a bucket. I also remember reading somewhere that his head only came up to the neck of the costume, which meant that he couldn't see anything. So, while I'll admit that the special effects in the movie are a bit dated, I still have a lot of respect for all the hard work that went into giving them to us. I really loved the music in this movie because it really enhances the constant sense of dread throughout and is perfectly fitting for this monstrous force of destruction. Godzilla's roar is also very iconic, and it always amazes me that it was made by someone running their hand along guitar strings. While the Godzilla series may not be my favorite monster series, I still have a lot of respect for it. In fact, I've had the pleasure of meeting some of the actors when they appeared at Chiller Theater. Back in October of 2014, I had the great pleasure of meeting Godzilla actors Haruo Nakajima, Kenpachiro Satsuma, and Tsutomu Kitagawa. I hope I pronounced that right. I got all three of them to sign this beautiful picture of all of their respective Godzillas. They signed it in big, beautiful gold. And I also got Haruo Nakajima to sign a poster, both a poster for the original Japanese classic, and a poster for the English-spoken King of the Monsters. I remember all three of them were very nice, but barely spoke any English. And unfortunately, Nakajima's health was clearly in decline. I remember at one point his handler had to kind of guide his hand while he signed. Back in 2013, I also had the great pleasure of meeting Akira Takarada and got him to sign the poster for the American version that I would later get signed by Haruo Nakajima a year later. He also didn't speak much English, but was also very nice, and he wrote his name in both English and Japanese. It's undeniable that Godzilla is an icon, and he has definitely earned his spot in cinema history. Well, that's all I've got to say about Gojira.
So, I hope you enjoyed my friend's short reviews of the original Godzilla. Now on to my thoughts on the Americanized version. Now, Godzilla was released in America in 1956 by Joseph E. Levine's company, NBC Pictures, under the title Godzilla King of the Monsters. But what they did was they didn't just release the original Japanese film and dub it over in English. This version of the film is almost a completely different movie because of how it's re-edited. Like, they remove a lot of scenes from the original Japanese version, or they switch scenes around, and also this version of the film features additional scenes directed by Terry Morse, featuring an American journalist named Steve Martin, not to be confused with the comedian Steve Martin, played by Raymond Burr. Now, Raymond Burr actually does a really good job in this movie, and I do really like the character of Steve Martin, and he actually does add a level of class and sophistication to what is basically just a B-movie version of Honda's original. But the movie's biggest failing is the fact that it is basically just a B-movie version of Honda's original, which, as I've already stated, I think is a cinematic masterpiece. This version of the film, it does cut out a lot of character moments, and it also downplays the political and social commentary of the original version. Now, the theme is still there, but it's not as prevalent as it is in the original Japanese version. Like, they cut out a lot of the direct references to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, I did grow up with this version of the film, and I even have it on VHS, but ever since I saw the original Japanese version, I really can't watch this version of the film anymore. But that's not to say that this version is bad. It's good if you're not familiar with the original Japanese cut, but I will say if you're only familiar with this version and you haven't seen the original Japanese version, you are doing yourself a massive disservice. And while Godzilla King of the Monsters is definitely inferior to Gojira, this version of the film does deserve a lot of credit because it is what introduced American audiences to Godzilla, and it's hard to say without this movie if Godzilla would have become the pop culture icon he is now. Now I want to cut to my friends again, giving their thoughts on Godzilla King of the Monsters, and when it cuts back to me, I'm going to be talking about the Godzilla sequels and Godzilla's legacy.
Before I knew that there was an original Godzilla film, I saw the Raymond Burr version, Godzilla King of the Monsters. Even like most Godzilla fans past generations, like my father for instance, he saw the Raymond Burr version first before he saw the original, and he likes the original more than Raymond Burr's version. To me, this was okay. It's not that it was like horrible or bad, it's just that at times I kind of found the film like distracting. Like, there were moments where you're watching scenes from the Japanese cut that are dubbed, and then all of a sudden it cuts to Raymond Burr, and you're like, wait a second, what just happened? It's like, we were focusing on this scene, now we cut to Raymond Burr, but it's obviously that those scenes were, like, you know, cut for, like, Raymond Burr and stuff like that, and not horrible, just very distracting. It was kind of hard to understand what was going on, and not a terrible film. It's just not, like, the best compared to the original, but it's okay. Not really much else to say about it.
Godzilla King of the Monsters was an Americanized version of the 1954 Japanese film Gojira. This movie contains a lot of the same footage from Gojira and mixes it with many new scenes of Raymond Burr as an American journalist who's covering the story of Godzilla. They edited those scenes together to make it appear like they were part of the original film. And there are also scenes in which the original Japanese dialogue is dubbed with English dialogue. The movie is entertaining, but I'll admit it is distracting that it's painfully obvious that the newly added footage is just added and a lot of the English dialogue is dubbed. Raymond Burr is pretty good to watch in this movie, and I've read that he was proud of his work in the film and later reprised his role in Godzilla in 1985. Well, that's all I've got to say about Godzilla King of the Monsters. I hope you all continue to do well and stay safe.
Now, even though the original Godzilla was made as a standalone film with no real intention of there ever being sequels, this film, of course, did have sequels, and it kickstarted a huge multimedia franchise. The movie ended up spawning 14 initial sequels, which together with the original film, make up what's now known as the Showa Godzilla series, because they came out during the Showa period of Japan. But by the time you got to the first sequel, Godzilla Raids Again, already the grim tone of the first film was completely gone, and the third film in the franchise, King Kong vs. Godzilla, was an outright comedy. And as the series went on, the tone got progressively lighter and lighter, and the films got sillier and sillier, and eventually the original anti-war message of the first film was completely lost. And eventually the films got geared more towards children. Godzilla went from being a horrifying metaphor for atomic destruction, and eventually became more of an anti-hero, until the 1970s, where Godzilla became an outright superhero. And the Godzilla films of the 1970s were basically live-action Saturday morning cartoons, and they bared very little similarities to Honda's original. But in the 80s, Toho rebooted the series with 1984's The Return of Godzilla, which acted as a direct sequel to the original film, ignoring the continuity of all the films in between, and that film was an attempt to return the series to its darker roots. The Return of Godzilla was released in the US as Godzilla 1985. Now, despite coming out when Japan was still in its Showa period, The Return of Godzilla, or Godzilla 1985, in retrospect is considered to be the first film of the Heisei Godzilla series, because all the sequels to it came out when Japan was in its Heisei period. Now, the Heisei Godzilla series ended in 1995 with Godzilla vs. Destroyer. Then in 1998 you had an American remake of Godzilla directed by Roland Emmerich. Then in 1999 Toho rebooted the series yet again with Godzilla 2000, which kicked off the Millennium Godzilla series, which ended in 2004 with Godzilla Final Wars. In 2014, there was an American reboot of Godzilla directed by Gareth Edwards and produced by Legendary, and this was the first film of Legendary's Monsterverse, which included Kong Skull Island and 2019's Godzilla King of the Monsters and the upcoming remake of King Kong vs. Godzilla. In 2016, Toho did another reboot of the franchise called Shin Godzilla, as well as a trilogy of anime films starting in 2017. Now, besides movies, the franchise has also spawned numerous comic books, including a comic book series done by Marvel in the 70s, which included a story where the Avengers fought Godzilla. Also, in the late 70s, Hanna-Barbera acquired the rights to Godzilla, and they produced an animated series called the Godzilla Power Hour. The franchise has also spawned numerous video games and toys. Also, let's not forget all the times Godzilla's been referenced throughout pop culture, like the Blue Oyster Cult song. Now, what's funny about that song, granted, I don't know if they actually had the original Godzilla in mind when they wrote that song, but the line, "History shows again how nature points out the folly of man," that actually sums up the themes of the original Godzilla really well. And then there have been many different parodies of Godzilla throughout pop culture. One that really comes to mind is Riptar from the Rugrats, which is a pretty overt parody of Godzilla. And let's not forget about all the other giant monster movies that were inspired by Godzilla. Stuff like the Gamera series, or shows like Ultraman, or movies like Gorgo, or even the other kaiju films that were put out by Toho. And also recent American monster films like Cloverfield, or Guillermo del Toro's Pacific Rim, or even movies like Rampage probably wouldn't exist if not for Godzilla and the franchise that Godzilla spawned. So yeah, that was my review on the original Godzilla, a.k.a. Gojira, and I will be reviewing the sequels very soon.